The two patrol officers who pulled up to my house that afternoon looked a lot more surprised to see me than I was to see them. I was standing at the end of my own driveway, arms crossed, next to a brand new steel gate I'd installed not 48 hours earlier, and the woman who'd called them out was still mid-sentence, gesturing wildly at me like I was some kind of criminal caught in the act, when the younger of the two officers glanced over at his partner and said, quiet enough that she probably wasn't meant to hear it, "Isn't that the chief? My name is Douglas Ferro. I'm 52 years old, and at the time all of this happened, I'd been serving as the chief of police for the small town of Ashcombe Hollow for a little over 4 months, having transferred in from a department 2 counties over after 26 years working my way up through the ranks. I'd bought a modest house on a quiet cul-de-sac in a neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates specifically, because it looked unremarkable, tucked away. Exactly the kind of place a man in my position wants to come home to at the end of a long shift, where nobody pays him any particular mind. I want to be clear that I never once mentioned my job to any of my neighbors when I moved in. Not out of secrecy or some deliberate strategy, but simply because I'm a private man by nature. And after 26 years of wearing a uniform in public, I liked the idea of being just another guy on the street for a change, somebody who mowed his lawn on Saturdays and kept mostly to himself. As far as most of Willow Creek Estates knew, I was just Doug, the quiet fellow in the gray house at the end of the cul-de-sac who worked long, irregular hours and didn't say much at the mailbox cluster. That anonymity held up just fine for almost 4 months. It fell apart entirely the day I put up a gate. The trouble, as it usually does in stories like this one, started small. My house sits at the very end of Willow Creek Estate's main cul-de-sac, and my driveway happens to run alongside a stretch of open grass that the neighborhood's homeowners association uses every summer for what they call the community block party, an event I genuinely didn't mind hosting adjacent to, since I've got nothing against neighbors enjoying a cookout and some lawn games on a Saturday afternoon. What I did mind, and what built up gradually over those first 4 months, was the steady stream of vehicles cutting directly across the edge of my driveway and onto that grass strip day and night, regardless of whether any event was actually happening. Delivery vans looking for a shortcut, teenagers practicing three-point turns, and most persistently, a woman named Felicity Marsh, who lived 2 houses down and served as president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, using the edge of my driveway as her own personal turnaround spot whenever she was backing her SUV out of the grass strip after inspecting the community garden beds she'd had installed there the previous spring. I mentioned it to her directly the first time, politely, the way you'd mention anything to a neighbor you were hoping to keep on decent terms with. She apologized, said she hadn't realized, and then did the exact same thing 3 days later. I mentioned it a second time. She apologized again, blamed her SUV's turning radius, and did it a third time the following week. By the 4th occurrence, I'd had enough of polite reminders. I ordered a simple steel gate, nothing elaborate, just a single arm barrier mounted on a post at the edge of my own property line, positioned to block vehicles from cutting across that corner of my driveway while still leaving my actual garage access completely open. I had it installed on a Tuesday morning by a local contractor, checked twice with the county to make sure the placement was entirely within my recorded property line, and thought that would be the end of the matter entirely. It was not the end of the matter. It was, as it turned out, only the beginning. Felicity Marsh discovered the gate the following Thursday afternoon, and according to the 2 officers who eventually arrived at my house, her exact words to the dispatcher were that a resident had illegally obstructed a shared community access easement and was refusing to cooperate with association representatives attempting to resolve the matter peacefully. I want to pause here and explain something important, because it matters a great deal to everything that followed. There was no shared community access easement running across the corner of my property. I'd checked twice with the county recorder's office before I ever ordered that gate, precisely because I wanted to be certain I wasn't overstepping any legitimate right-of-way before I put a single post in the ground. My property line ran exactly where I believed it ran, confirmed by the same recorded plat map the county used for every other lot in Willow Creek Estates, and nothing in that plat indicated any easement, shared or otherwise, crossing my land. Felicity, as it turned out, had simply assumed for years that the strip of grass beside my driveway functioned as community property, largely because the previous owner of my house, an elderly man who'd lived there for decades before selling to me, had apparently never objected to the neighborhood using it that way. Assumption, repeated long enough without correction, has a funny way of calcifying into something people treat as established fact. And Felicity had clearly been operating under exactly that kind of calcified assumption for a very long time. When I didn't immediately remove the gate at her request that Thursday afternoon, standing my ground calmly and explaining, as politely as I could manage for the fourth time in 2 weeks, that the property line was mine and the gate was staying, she pulled out her phone and called 911, describing the situation in terms dramatic enough that I later learned the dispatcher had genuinely believed she might be reporting an active altercation rather than a disagreement about a steel pole. The 2 officers who responded were both fairly new to the department, having joined Ashcombe Hollow's force within the past year, which meant neither of them had worked directly under me in my previous assignment, and likely hadn't had much occasion to sit through department-wide briefings where I'd have been introduced by name and photograph. I recognized them both from the station, of course, having reviewed personnel files and sat in on roll call more times than I could count over my 4 months in the role. But there was no particular reason either of them would have connected the quiet man in a t-shirt standing at the end of his own driveway with the chief whose signature appeared on their paychecks. Felicity met them at the curb before I'd even finished walking down from my porch, launching immediately into an account of events that painted me as an unreasonable, possibly unstable neighbor who'd erected an illegal barricade across community property and refused all attempts at reasonable resolution. I stood quietly and let her finish, mostly out of professional habit, since I've learned over 26 years that letting an agitated person talk themselves out is usually more productive than interrupting them. The younger officer, whose name tag read Delacroix, turned to me once Felicity had wound down and asked, in the careful, neutral tone officers are trained to use in situations like this, whether I could explain my side of what had happened. Officer, I said, before I do, I want to be straightforward with you about something. I'm Douglas Ferro. I believe we haven't had much occasion to meet directly yet, since I've only been in the role a short while, but I'm the chief of police for this department. I watched Delacroix's expression shift through several stages in the space of about 2 seconds. Confusion, recognition, and finally something close to quiet alarm. The particular alarm of a young officer realizing he's just spent the last several minutes treating his own department head as a routine dispute call. His partner, a somewhat older officer named Reyes, glanced over at me with an expression that suggested he was doing some fast mental math of his own. Felicity, for her part, went very quiet very quickly. I want to be entirely fair here and say that I didn't use that moment to pull rank or intimidate anyone, and I made a point of telling both officers to proceed exactly as they would with any other call, treating me the same as they would treat any resident involved in a neighbor dispute. Because the last thing any police department needs is officers who start treating situations differently based on who happens to be standing in front of them. I asked them to review the property line documentation I had waiting inside, the same recorded plat map I'd already checked with the county, and to make their own independent determination about whether any actual violation had occurred. Officer Reyes reviewed the documents carefully at my kitchen table while Delacroix stood near the door, still looking somewhat shaken by the whole encounter. After several minutes, Reyes looked up and said plainly that the recorded plat showed no easement whatsoever crossing my property, and that as far as he could determine, the gate had been installed entirely within my own recorded boundary line. "Ma'am," Reyes said, walking back out to where Felicity was still standing near her car, "there's no legal violation here. This gate is on private property, and Mr. Ferro is within his rights to install it exactly where he has." Felicity's response, once she'd absorbed that information, was to pivot immediately toward a different line of argument, insisting that regardless of the technical property line, the neighborhood had used that strip of grass for community purposes for years, and that removing access now would create what she called a significant hardship for association events going forward. "That may well be true," Reyes told her, with the patience of a man who's had this exact conversation with homeowners associations more times than he probably cares to count. "But that's a civil matter between you and Mr. Ferro, not something we can enforce through a police call. I want to explain something about what happened over the following weeks, because the driveway itself, as it turned out, was really just the surface of a much larger pattern that had been building in Willow Creek Estates for a considerably longer time than anyone outside the immediate neighborhood had noticed. Word travels fast in a small town, and word travels even faster when the person a homeowners association president called 911 on turns out to be the town's own police chief. Within a few days, I started hearing, through casual conversations with other officers at the station, and a couple of neighbors who finally felt comfortable speaking up once they realized who I was, that Felicity Marsh's approach to running Willow Creek Estates had been considerably more aggressive than the friendly, community-minded reputation she'd cultivated at neighborhood gatherings. A retired schoolteacher named Harriet Voss, who lived across the cul-de-sac from me, stopped by a few days after the driveway incident to introduce herself properly, having apparently decided that a neighbor willing to stand his ground against Felicity was a neighbor worth actually getting to know. "You have no idea how long some of us have been dealing with her," Harriet told me over coffee at my kitchen table. "She's got this way of deciding what the rules are supposed to mean, regardless of what they actually say on paper, and most people just go along with it because arguing with her takes more energy than most folks want to spend." Harriet described a pattern that had been building for the better part of 3 years under Felicity's presidency, involving selective enforcement of landscaping rules, unexplained special assessment fees that never seemed to result in any actual visible improvements, and at least 2 other instances where Felicity had involved law enforcement or code enforcement over disputes that turned out, on closer inspection, to have no legitimate legal basis at all. I want to be honest that I hesitated, initially, about getting more deeply involved in what was, on paper, a homeowners association matter entirely separate from my professional duties. But as chief of police for a small town, I take it seriously when I learn that residents have repeatedly involved my department in disputes that turn out, upon review, to have no legal foundation whatsoever. Because every one of those calls represents officer time and resources spent on something that should never have required a police response in the first place. I asked one of our records clerks, a meticulous woman named Priscilla Okonkwo who'd worked at the department for over 15 years, to pull the call history for Willow Creek Estates going back 3 years, simply to understand the scope of what Harriet had described. What came back was more extensive than I'd expected. 14 separate calls originating from Felicity Marsh's address, or explicitly referencing her as the reporting party. The majority involving claims of property line violations, unauthorized structures, or community easement disputes that, in every single case where an officer had actually reviewed the underlying property documentation, turned out to have no legal basis at all. I mentioned this pattern, carefully and through proper channels, to the town's code enforcement office, since several of those calls had also generated formal citations against residents that, based on what I was seeing in our own call records, appeared to rest on the same kind of assumed authority Felicity had displayed with my own driveway gate. The code enforcement supervisor, a careful man named Desmond Ilori who'd been reviewing property disputes in Ashcombe Hollow for nearly 2 decades, pulled the citation history himself and came back to me within the week with findings that mirrored exactly what Priscilla had found in our own call logs. Of the 11 citations issued to Willow Creek, Estates residents over the previous 3 years based on complaints originating from Felicity Marsh. 7 had eventually been dismissed or overturned on appeal. In every instance because the underlying property claim didn't hold up under actual scrutiny of recorded deeds and plat maps. What emerged, once Desmond and I compared notes properly, was a picture of a homeowners association president who had spent years operating on the assumption that her own interpretation of community boundaries and shared responsibilities carried the same legal weight as an actual recorded document, and who had, in at least several documented instances, used the threat of official involvement, whether from code enforcement or from the police department directly, as a tool to pressure residents into compliance with rules that existed more in her own understanding of the neighborhood than in any properly filed association document. I want to be fair to Felicity in one respect. I don't believe, based on everything I eventually learned, that she set out with any deliberately malicious intent. I think, much like the calcified assumption about my own driveway grass strip, she had simply operated for so long without anyone seriously challenging her interpretation of the rules that she'd come to genuinely believe her authority extended considerably further than it actually did. That distinction matters, I think, even if the practical consequences for the residents affected by her citations and calls were exactly the same regardless of her intentions. The Willow Creek Estates Board held its regularly scheduled quarterly meeting about 6 weeks after the incident at my driveway, and I want to say plainly that I did not attend that meeting myself, nor did I involve myself directly in any HOA governance matter, since that would have crossed a line I wasn't willing to cross as a public official. What I did do, at Desmond's suggestion, was ensure that the Code Enforcement Office's full findings regarding the 7 overturned citations were formally shared with the full board, through entirely proper administrative channels, rather than allowing that information to remain informally scattered among individual residents comparing stories at the mailbox. Harriet Voss, who did attend that meeting, told me afterward that the presentation of those findings landed with the kind of quiet, devastating weight that comes from simply laying out documented facts, without any dramatic accusation attached to them. Several board members, according to Harriet, had genuinely believed for years that Felicity's enforcement decisions carried proper legal backing, and watching 7 citations laid out side by side with the corresponding dismissal notices made it clear, in a way no amount of prior grumbling among neighbors ever had, exactly how much of the association's authority had been quietly manufactured, rather than properly grounded in recorded community rules. Felicity resigned from the board position about 2 weeks after that meeting, in a brief note distributed to residents citing what she described as personal reasons and a desire to focus on other commitments, language that fooled almost nobody in the neighborhood by that point, given how thoroughly word of the code enforcement findings had already spread. The board brought in Harriet, somewhat to her own surprise, as interim president, and one of her first actions was to commission a proper, independent survey of the shared community areas throughout Willow Creek Estates, resolving once and for all which strips of grass, walking paths, and common areas actually belonged to the association versus which had simply been informally treated that way for years without any legal basis. As for my own gate, it stayed exactly where I'd installed it, and I never had another vehicle attempt to cut across that corner of my property again. I did, admittedly, feel a small measure of satisfaction watching the community garden beds Felicity had installed on the association's actual grass strip get properly relocated a few feet over once the new survey clarified the real boundary lines. Though I'll admit that satisfaction had more to do with simple vindication than any lasting grudge against her personally. I still don't make a particular point of announcing my job to new neighbors when I meet them, mostly because I still value the quiet, unremarkable version of myself that gets to just be Doug at the mailbox cluster most days of the week. But I'll admit that story got around Ashcombe Hollow fast enough that most of Willow Creek Estates knows exactly who lives in the gray house at the end of the cul-de-sac now. And I've noticed, with a certain wry amusement, that community meetings have run considerably more carefully with the actual recorded rules ever since. Officer Delacroix still turns a little red whenever the story comes up around the station, and I've made a point of telling him more than once that he handled that call exactly the way he should have, treating me the same as he would any other resident until the facts of the property line themselves settled the matter. That's really the whole lesson underneath this entire story, if there is one. Rules only mean anything when they're grounded in something real, whether that's a recorded deed, a properly filed easement, or simply an honest conversation between neighbors rather than an assumption calcified over years into something people mistake for settled fact. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are plenty more stories just like this one still to come. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this one, or whether you've ever had a neighbor assume they had more authority over your property than they actually did. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video just like this one.